This is Alone in the Dark, a reimagining of a classic horror game from the 90s. Be sure to like the video, subscribing is great as well. So we're here on Xbox Series X, where we will get a couple graphical options, and we'll be talking about that in a sec. But when the game starts, you get to pick which character you want to play as. We've got David Harbour there as this detective, and we've got Jodie Comer as this lady that is looking for her missing uncle. It's rather intriguing and sets the premise for where we are about to venture forward into, a place of mystery and darkness. So what are we getting here on Xbox Series X? Well, we have two options. The first is a performance mode. The second, which we're going to be switching to here, is a quality mode. So quality is a full 4K at 30 FPS. The performance mode is a dynamic 1800p at 60 FPS. For the majority of this video, you will be seeing performance mode in action, as it just felt better to play, but there is a significant bump up in terms of resolution fidelity when you do the quality mode. Now, this isn't a game that necessarily calls for having that performance level, but it does feel better when you're playing through it, more natural, more realistic. There's also the field of view option, which you kind of saw there, and some other little visual adjustments that you can make for when you are jumping in and playing this game. It's a single player experience, and if you're wondering about spoilers, this is literally like the first 20-ish minutes of the game. I filmed the beginning, then I played through the whole game, and then I did the video here because I thought this was the most effective way to let you see how it's running, get an idea of things, but also allow me to come in and do a review. And I will be trying to keep things as spoiler-free as possible as we dive into what this game has to offer. And you know what? I kind of liked it, and it's very interesting. I do really think, though, when you're looking at this, to keep in mind that this is more of like a double A type of experience. It is something that is like several hours long. I think that was pretty much me working through it without too much guidance, but I also think I was idling a bit. So I think several hours is about what I would say is a single run of this game. Now, with you being able to choose either character, you can replay it twice. The beginning is very similar, and then the game begins to divulge as the characters kind of split across, and I did play a bit of the second part just so that I could kind of get an idea of things. And depending on what sort of extras you find, could also alter for additional playthroughs what exactly happens as you get a more full experience. So this is something that is meant to be played multiple times. I think if you play through it once, you can have a decent time. I had fun with it. I was like, yeah, I kind of like this. And then if you do like it quite a bit, you want to see more of the atmosphere in the world, it does change. And again, they gave me some details and context into this as well. It does change a fair bit as you go through it, depending on which character performance you kind of go for. So here we are going to Derceto Manor, Derceto Manor, whatever the case. It's a manor, it's a building. It's like an old school Resident Evil 90s cult classic horror game setup. It's a Gothic American South location set in the 1920s, and there's a noir setting and a little bit of Lovecraftian horror elements being infused into the style. So I mentioned Resident Evil because it does kind of feel like the traditional Resident Evil games. You're in this large building, you're going through the different rooms, you're collecting, collectibles, you're gathering these things that will allow you to solve puzzles, and there's a certain sense of freedom where you can kind of go and directly do something or maybe look around. It is restricted, but the more you explore, the more you progress, the more you do, the more the environment opens up for you. And depending on the character and the playthrough, your environment will also change as well, because the story and the setting is going to adjust along with that, which is kind of neat. So yeah, I definitely found this one to be particularly fascinating and really quite interesting from a single player perspective. So Jeremy Hartwood has gone missing, and then prompted by a letter, his niece, Emily Hartwood, Jodie Comer, is then engaging with private detective Edward Carnby, Harbour, to accompany her to the Manor, an old house deep in the bayou, now a home for the mentally fatigued. I know, shocking, right? And that's kind of where the story begins. From there, as you've selected your particular character for your particular run, you are going into the house and exploring a selection of finely detailed rooms as you solve puzzles. At times, it seems really simplistic. At times, it becomes a little bit more complex. You can choose how you engage with the game as well. There are difficulty settings, from story to more of a difficult scenario. There are fine-tuned puzzle options as well. Do you want more of an old school, you have to figure out everything? Or do you want one that's a little bit more clued in? And there's a selection of, I think, several choices you can make for how guided everything is. There were still a couple times where I was sort of sitting there being like, huh, what? But I did eventually figure everything out. I don't think anything was too difficult. And obviously, if you're playing this game in the current state of the internet and whatnot, I'm sure you'll be able to find anything answers-wise that you're missing pretty easily. Now, with this game, I did have a number of technical issues. They are supposed to be working on this. It is supposed to be improving. There were some situations where things didn't work, and I had to reload my last save. So you get one autosave, and then as many manual saves as you want. So when playing this, most of it works, but I would recommend occasionally making saves, just in case anything pops up. But usually the autosave would fix anything. One issue I had a few times was my character just wouldn't be able to, like, battle, and the enemies would hit me, but I was also invulnerable, so it was kind of like you just couldn't do anything because you couldn't progress, and that was a little weird. But then loading the autosave, which was usually pretty exact, I never really lost any time, so just something I wanted to highlight. And then for performance, quality mode seemed to run smoothly. I didn't really see any issues when I was playing around with quality mode. Performance mode is a little erratic. Like at times it's smooth, it's fine, it's really good, and at times it just randomly dips, and there seems to be a lot of like loading slowness, if that makes sense. Like you'll be kind of moving around interacting with scenes, and then all of a sudden it just kind of really has some issues getting to the next spot. And I think that's because they're sort of pushing the technology in some interesting ways, because you are moving through certain environments that were once, like, literally you'll walk through a door and it'll have been one thing, and then you turn around and you go through that door and it'll be like another thing. So that's where I think that issue is kind of coming into play. It's really neat, and I'll talk about it more when we jump into the story elements of this. But just like technically, I do want it to be clear that like there are definitely performance issues in performance mode. They are supposed to be ironing those out. So I don't know if it'll be cleaner from when you played, but it wasn't anything that was too bad when I was playing the game for this being like a story game. Like I didn't feel that it was a negative to what I was doing, but it was something that was present while I was playing, and it was something that I did, you know, feel while I was going through this, and I definitely wanted to highlight that in case you were wondering about the technical elements of this. So let's talk more about the story. So we've got either your detective or you've got the niece, and you're going through these environments. Most of the time, you're walking along, your character's talking about stuff, you're picking up collectibles, you might hear an audio recording from said collectible, you're gathering these things to solve puzzles, you might be inspecting puzzle pieces, adding puzzle pieces to objects, moving things around, rotating stuff. It's pretty simplistic. It is a bit of a... I throw it back to those old school adventure games. It's not like a point and click, but, you know, it is an adventure title with a story focus. It's narrative driven, and it's about this psychological journey that you go through. Things seem fine, dandy, and realistic, and then as you continue to progress, things get more twisted, more weird, and there is actually like a pretty good sense of mystery. I would say I was decently hooked in the premise, kind of trying to figure out what was going on. I did feel like there were some limitations with this kind of being, again, like a AA type title, where I was kind of like, this could have been expanded upon a little bit further. But I like the throwback feeling to those old Resident Evil games where you are figuring out rooms, the story is unraveling as you explore. There are enemies you have to deal with. The combat is kind of cumbersome, but it sort of fits for this type of game. Like, you get a pistol, and then there's some additional guns that you will find along the way. I won't spoil those, I guess, but you do get some other tools. And also, whatever melee weapon you pick up in the environment, you might pick up a flask, which will be for your health. And yeah, it's kind of straightforward. Like, the combat sequence is usually pretty linear. There's also some cool environmental things, like you might pick up a bottle, throw it at an enemy, and then shoot it, and like lights them on fire. It's interesting. It's kind of neat. And I did like the sense of scale too. With it still being a AA game, I want to keep reminding people of that. You get to visit some really fantastical places, and there were some, like, I don't know if it was like scary, but it was kind of like there were some unsettling spots and some kind of like jump scare type things, but not jump scares in the way you think. And I actually, like, it got me like a couple times, because there is, as I've mentioned, this kind of pacing where you're sort of moving slowly, you're taking your, you're going through the environment, you're exploring, you're seeing things, and you get this like false sense of like calm, and then you'll open a door and you'll be like, whoa, wasn't expecting that. And yeah, it's kind of interesting from that perspective, so I like that. I'm not really super familiar with the origins, I guess you would say, of Alone in the Dark. I'm familiar with the fact that this has been sort of done a few times with a few different like styles and perspectives, so I do understand that there is a legacy here. So this really was fresh for me, so I didn't have like a foundational point for which I was sort of comparing it to. And yeah, I kind of enjoyed it. Like I said, like, it wasn't the craziest, most groundbreaking story game of all time, but it was fun. It was an enjoyable, decently sized story that you could sit through. I did like the performance from Harbour. I thought it was pretty decent. The Comer performance also seems pretty good from what I've kind of checked out from her and seen her within his story, and again, kind of giving a little bit of a whirl so I could get an idea of how that perspective works. I was like, okay, seems like the performances are pretty good. Secondary cast seems really good too. Very happy. And it's sort of neat and almost like slightly stilted to some degree too, in regards to like how you meet characters. Like, you'll literally just randomly come across, like, you'll go into a room, you'll randomly meet someone, talk to them, and then they'll kind of vanish. And I think that's sort of neat because it gives you just enough to keep the mystery going, but not enough where you're sitting there just kind of getting a lot of exposition. And it's sort of fascinating as you're going through these alternate areas, these alternate worlds that appear. Like, I know why they appear, and that sort of gets told to you as the game goes along, so I think it's better just to kind of keep that a bit of a surprise for it to be revealed to you when you're playing as to why you're going to these areas, what these areas mean to characters. And I think that's all rather fascinating and rather interesting. So from a story perspective, I enjoyed this game. I thought it was kind of cool. I liked the characters. I liked the main characters. I liked some of the supporting individuals. I think that really helps round things out. It's pretty straightforward in what it has to offer, but I almost think that it's kind of punching above its weight class in terms of the visual style. Like, the rooms are very full. It's kind of like, it might feel sort of linear, I guess, to some degree as you move through areas. But these areas, they're really quite detailed. There's a lot going on within them. There's lots of stuff you can kind of interact with. The more you sort of look and touch stuff and gather stuff, like, there's these special collectibles that you gather, and on one side you can gather, like, you gather sets of these things, and you gather sets for this character, and then, if you go in through the other lady, you can collect sets and kind of finish sets between the two of them, and then the sets will kind of enhance your overall potential narratives if you go for further plays. So there is a lot more to this one that kind of meets the eye as you work through it, which I think is rather intriguing. But yeah, you're just kind of lightly interacting with things. As I mentioned, it mostly feels intuitive. Like, it's linear, but a little open at times, a little bit of freedom. You're not pushed to specifically do stuff, but but you do have to progress forward. The more free areas are that around the house, and the house becomes more and more free with the more and more you open, and it's going to feel a little bit more guided depending on which guidance setting you choose. Like I mentioned, you can be a little bit more, oh, I want something that is focused, I need a little bit more guidance, I want to enjoy the story, or I love that sense of being lost in this manor area and trying to figure out everything and what I need to do. It was kind of cool though, sitting there and not having like any real guidance and stuff like that, which was interesting because obviously when I'm reviewing it ahead of launch, we don't have like, I can't just look up a puzzle right away, right? Like I actually have to sit there and figure it out. And there actually was a guidance book that I found for like a certain area where I was kind of like, huh? And I kind of looked at it and I was like, oh, okay, I'm not doing this correctly or something. And I was like, oh, okay, right. So it's kind of neat. It's an interesting story. I think we've got some cool characters, some cool moments. I think the performances here do kind of help a lot for kind of carrying this narrative, especially if you're familiar with the actors involved for the leads. And I do sort of wonder what the expectations are going to be from everyone when they come in and take a look at this one, as I did like it for what it is, but I can't help but feel like there were certain situations and scenarios where I was kind of like, I wish this was a little bit more in-depth, a little bit larger. But, for something that is AA in nature and design, I think they actually kind of hit the mark pretty well. It was a fun, like I said, kind of several hour long story perspective. I think you could finish it a lot quicker if you knew exactly what you're supposed to do, because there is an achievement for finishing it under 3 hours, which I was sort of sitting there being like, well, if I knew how to do every story a little bit, if I was skipping along through like cutscenes, if I knew where the puzzles were supposed to go immediately without having to think about it, or all the locks. And I was like, okay, I guess I could theorize that you could do that. As I don't want people to sit there and look at that achievement and be like, oh, well, you can do this super fast. Like, there is some amount of length to it if you are sitting there taking in the story, figuring out clues within the environment, solving everything. It does start out very, very simple. As I've mentioned, you've maybe even seen that in the game as I've been playing it off the bat here. But it does gain levels of complexity as you go back and forth from these fantastical fantasy worlds back into the manor, and then back into the worlds, and then back into the manor. And it's this neat sort of change up. Some of the elements and themes are reoccurring, and then it sort of just builds upon itself. There is a good sense of mystery, as I've mentioned. I don't know if there was any sort of insane high level of hook where you're like, oh, but there is like, oh, okay, this makes sense, and it sort of builds upon itself as the narrative progresses, especially if you're sitting there listening to some of the clues, getting a context further beyond just like gameplay, but actually sitting there and engaging with all the material and solving things. Because sometimes you have to look at your notes to understand what you're supposed to do to solve certain puzzles. It's neat to see this building level of rot within the environment. And yeah, I think overall it's kind of just pretty well put together. Like, it's got some neat flashy elements of it that are very reminiscent of horror games from the 90s, but in the context of the modern era. And I actually think it would be really interesting. I don't know if they would do like an Alone in the Dark 2 necessarily, but taking this gameplay style and kind of applying it to other types of games, and like a new adventure game style of the modern era, I think would work pretty well. So I did have fun with it. I did think it was pretty decent. There's definitely your game value if you go through it multiple times to play the different perspectives. And it's not just like replaying it, right? Like, it actually does have a difference depending on which lead you play. So it's sort of like a 2-in-1 type of thing. I think if you just play it through like once, like I sort of have at this point, you're going to be satisfied. If you go through it twice, I think you'll get even more out of it if you're that into what this game has to offer, or, take a break and come back. Kind of a cool setup. It's neat. It's interesting. It's got some well-detailed environments. There are issues, like I've highlighted, with the performance, and hopefully that gets cleaned up. And, it is a little tighter in scale, and it's not crazy and out there in terms of settings and mechanics, but it's fun, it's engaging, it's a nice sort of bite-sized story that doesn't overstay its welcome. If anything, actually, I felt it could have been, like I said, even longer, and I would have been fine with that too. But it was nice to kind of sit there, play through it, have a decent time, enjoy the performances, enjoy the atmosphere, which I think they nail, and just kind of enjoy what this one has to offer. It was a fun game. It was neat being alone in the dark, and Like I said, I don't know if it stays up to the legacy of the series, but I enjoyed this particular offering and this entry and would like to see more, I guess.